Subscribe before the truth disappears, because the road keeps its own secrets. The storm on I-25 rose like a bad memory, low clouds dragging their knuckles across Wyoming as the afternoon drained to iron. Trucks hulked in the right lane with their hazards winking, taillights smeared red across wet asphalt. Somewhere between Cheyenne and Casper, a small black car with a vanity plate, LIL MISS, slid through the weather and into the kind of darkness that swallows names. At 6:41 p.m., a state trooper angled his cruiser behind a sedan abandoned at a turnout just past a cattle guard. The wipers thumped, the radio muttered weather and numbers. No driver, no keys, only the ghost of a handprint on the rear window, rain dissolving it line by line. He stepped out, lifted the trunk, and found it empty. When he looked up, the wind pulled a scrap of plastic from the grass and slapped it against his boot. It was a temporary tag sleeve, sliced open in a way that felt deliberate. The trooper bent, bagged it, and called it in. Missing person from last night, Denver to Billings, 20-something, brunette, going to see her boyfriend. Car plate says LIL MISS. We've got the car, we don't have her. By midnight, the turnout was a nest of tripods, latex gloves, and low voices. Deputy Sarah Vance, new to violent crimes, stood in the rain with a spiral notebook cradled inside her jacket. The license plate, that cheeky little boast, glowed like a dare under flash. A senior investigator named Cade crouched by the front bumper, tracing the faint crescent scratch where it had kissed something harder than paint. No skid, no panic. She pulled in on purpose. He smelled the hood, cold, and not recently. Sarah angled her flashlight along the shoulder. The runoff cut small tributaries through gravel and straw. There were footprints, but the rain had turned them into blurs. Farther down, she found a fresh cigarette butt anchored in mud, brand stamped along the filter. She clicked a marker flag into the ground. One thing about storms, they ruin evidence, and sometimes they wash it right to your feet. They canvassed the truck stop 5 miles back. A waitress with a beehive and a calendar of oil changes in her head remembered the girl. Pretty, polite, alone. Tacoma with Montana plates took the corner too fast and made her flinch. The girl flinched too. The waitress saw the plate, but the storm smudged it in her brain. Something with an F or an E. She remembered the girl asked for directions, napkin soggy at her straw. "Keep north," the waitress said now. She smiled like she'd already decided that. The cook said a thin man in a dirty cap asked the girl where she was headed, words casual, eyes not. The cook didn't like the cap. Caps hide faces. The cashier said the man left before the girl. The busboy said the girl left first. Everyone was sure. Everyone was wrong in a different way. 2 days in, the LIL MISS plate ended up on a corkboard in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and wet wool. The photographs around it multiplied. Exit ramps, tanker shadows, thumbprints that matched no one. A map bled red pins between Fort Collins and Thermopolis. "She never makes it to Billings," Cade said. "So either the road took her or someone else did. The road doesn't dig holes." Sarah didn't argue. She'd learned early the road is the most efficient accomplice grief ever had. It gives you a direction and a reason and then opens its mouth. Still, this wasn't random. The vanity plate was a beacon. Strangers remember beacons. She put up a flyer with the plate like a headline. Who saw LIL MISS? She drove the route at dawn and listened to the weather talk to the hills. She stopped where the asphalt went rough and the cattle fences leaned, and she walked until the silence pressed on her ears. A week turned to 2. The car yielded no blood, no hair, no fingerprints that didn't belong to its owner. A shoe turned up near a culvert 20 miles north. Too small, too new, not hers. People sent in angels and theories. Truckers brought thermoses of coffee and stories of girls who thumbed their fate. The case swallowed hours. The case stole sleep. It broke open years later in a laboratory light that made everything look honest. Sarah, not so new anymore, stood behind glass while a technician pinned a little tube to a rack and talked about alleles and lottery odds. From a hair recovered on a piece of rope found near a river bend, from skin cells scraped off a trunk latch nobody had quite given up on, the computer wrote a name. Not a full name yet, but enough to knock at the door of a DNA database and say, "Do you know this voice?" The database did. Dale Wayne Eaton had a record that thinned and thickened like creek ice depending on the season and the judge. A neighbor remembered him as quiet and peculiar. A deputy remembered him as mean when he drank, mean or sober. He owned beaters with primer spots and took engines apart in his yard until his yard looked part engine. When they served the warrant, his dogs announced strangers with a fury that echoed off tin. Sarah watched from beyond the fence while the evidence team worked by the book and with gloves thick as good conscience. They brought out boxes, a pry bar, a tarpaulin that had learned too many shapes, and photo albums where faces smiled on pages sticky with time. They found a spade polished by hands that didn't plant much. They found an old registration stub for a truck that had no business on the road, and a faded map with a circle where there should have been nothing. In interview, Eaton's voice was a dry road. He sat with his hands flat and said he didn't remember a car with a name for a plate. He didn't remember March of 1988. He didn't remember the weather or the waitress or the girl. When confronted with DNA too precise to be dismissed as coincidence, he remembered something else. He'd helped a traveler whose car had died. She'd been grateful and impatient. He'd pointed her back to the highway. She'd left alive. He said they'd never even touched. He said any contact had been accidental, the way people bump and brush in a world full of elbows. Eaton tried on explanations like jackets at a thrift shop. Some too big, some too small, all of them with someone else's wear. In one version, he found the black car already abandoned near his property and nosed it to the road as a favor. In another, he never saw the car at all and the DNA was junk science or conspiratorial malice. In a third, a nameless friend borrowed his tools and his yard and his bad luck. None of it felt right in the bones, but what grips a jury isn't feeling, it's pattern. Sarah went looking for the one thing that couldn't be cozy with a lie. It was a remark he made and perhaps wished he could pull back as it left his mouth. The recording caught it with the same indifferent fidelity that had recorded the room's fluorescent hum. "How would I know where her car went?" Eaton said, voice tight with practiced outrage. "I never dug no hole on—" He stopped, blinked. On no riverbank. Sarah's pen paused before she let it keep moving. She hadn't asked about a riverbank. No one had asked about digging.
They didn't pounce. They let it sit there between them like a shard of glass the room would eventually lean on. Eaton recovered. People do. He drifted back into denial, as if denial had a current. But when they mapped his property line against old aerial photos, there it was, geometric and obscene. A rectangle of ground that had been disturbed and smoothed, refilled in a way natural weather never does. On the surface, nothing but scrub, and a rock that looked as though it had been made to look like a rock. The county brought in a backhoe, because spades are too slow when time has already done its damage. The machine bit, coughed earth, bit again. The smell rose first, wet iron and rot the soil had kept for an audience it didn't want. The bucket rang against something hollow. The operator lifted, set down, wiped away mud like sweat. The top of a roofline appeared, then a windshield glittered like a fish's flank. A license plate emerged, black and innocent in the light, letters cheerful and terrible in one breath. LIL MISS. The crowd of uniforms and boots forgot how to shift its weight. Sarah felt the wind push at her back, as if to keep her from taking the last step toward what the ground was finally giving back. The crane made its noises. The car rose from the pit the way a lie sometimes does. Slow, reluctant, creaking with the effort of being seen. She walked forward until her reflection smeared across the glass, and the mud on the trunk latch, preserved by the mean mercy of cold, the lab would find a partial print that belonged to the man who said he didn't remember touching anything that mattered. And yet, even then, even with the car in the air and the plate spelling itself in her chest, something else didn't fit. Eaton's story, one of them, had placed the car in the river, a confession threaded with the hope water erases what juries need. But the car wasn't baptized by current, it was entombed in a private geometry, a grave with corners, a secret he believed he could keep by putting weight on it. Sarah looked at the rock the backhoe had lifted free, the one Eaton had rolled there, or dragged, or bribed a friend to move. It would take 3 men to set it. Rage can be a team sport. As the chassis cleared the cut, something clinked off steel and fell back into the dirt. Sarah crouched and plucked a metal scrap from the wet. A license plate frame, cheap in chrome, with a cracked phrase along the bottom. She wiped it with her cuff. The slogan read, "Wyoming, Forever West." Forever is a long time to get the truth wrong, she thought. They hadn't opened the car yet. They hadn't touched the doors. The crane operator steadied the swing. Somewhere, a meadowlark decided the field could still be a place where songs were permitted. Sarah stepped closer, felt the old road rise in her ears, the sound of trucks and rain, and a name no longer willing to be just a name. When they finally broke the seal on the driver's door and the air returned from 1988 to argue with the wind, everything changed.
The courtroom in Cheyenne was a theater of echoes. Even the coughs seemed rehearsed. It was spring of 2004, 16 years after Lisa Marie Kimmell vanished into Wyoming weather, and the state had decided the past would finally stand up and explain itself. Dale Wayne Eaton sat at the defense table, his face slack as concrete. Across from him, a projection screen showed photographs the color of stormwater. The LIL MISS car dragged from its private grave, the license plate black against mud. The jurors watched with the quiet concentration of people looking at a wound they couldn't bandage. Detective Sarah Vance sat 2 rows behind the prosecution, her badge turned inward on her belt. She'd long since traded fieldwork for a desk, but this case was the one that wouldn't unhook from her ribs. Every frame of evidence was a memory, every testimony a pulse. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Whitaker, paced in front of the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant claims he simply found the vehicle abandoned," he said. "He claims he had no idea what happened to Lisa Marie Kimmell. But his DNA was found inside her car and on the rope tied around her wrists. He claims he doesn't remember how it got there." He paused at the screen and pointed to the projected photograph. The shallow pit, the roof of the car peeking through soil. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, he buried her car in his own backyard. The defense rose. "Objection, inflammatory." The judge didn't look up. Overruled. The image lingered for a moment too long before the slide advanced to Eaton's handwritten statement from 1998, signed in a trembling scrawl. "I never buried any car. The hole by the river wasn't mine. The cops dug where they wanted." Sarah watched his face as the words filled the courtroom. He didn't flinch, just a jaw muscle twitching, like something still trapped in there, still resisting the air. When the recess came, she slipped outside to the courthouse steps. The wind coming down from the mountains was sharper than she remembered. She stood with her coffee cooling in her hand and thought about the first time she saw the LIL MISS plate under that gray sky, the way the rain had washed its letters clean while everything else turned to blur. The detail that undid him, the riverbank slip, had become legend in the department, the small thing that cracked the lie wide open. But the more Sarah revisited it, the less clean it felt. She had been the one who caught the phrasing. She had been the one who ordered the dig. And yet, something about Eaton's tone that day, the faint smile when he said no riverbank, stayed with her like grit in the eye. In the motel room across from the courthouse, she reopened her old case file, thinned and yellowing now. One page, a map printed from a state survey, showed Eaton's property with the burial site circled in red. She'd always believed it was his land. But the new case review last month, done as part of the appeal process, suggested something else. The actual property line ended 20 meters short of the pit. The car had been buried on county land, which meant Eaton hadn't buried it on his property, not technically. That detail shouldn't have mattered, but it did, because his slip, "I never dug no hole on no riverbank," could have been literal. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe someone else had, close enough to frame him, but far enough to make it confusing decades later.
She hated this kind of thought, the kind that crept in after the verdict was already decided. But she couldn't shake it. That night, while the courthouse lights dimmed, she met with Whitaker in the diner down the road. He was halfway through a slice of pie when she slid the survey map across the table. 20 meters, she said. That's how far off the line the burial site was. Whitaker squinted. So, what if he didn't dig it? What if someone else did and left it there for him to find? Whitaker's fork clinked. Come on, Sarah, we've got DNA, rope fibers, tool marks. You're not reopening this for a technicality. I'm not reopening it, she said. I'm just saying, maybe the story isn't finished. He smiled without warmth. You think there's another player hiding in the wings after all this time? We checked his family, his brother, his drinking buddies. You think somebody framed a drifter for a body they didn't bury? I think someone helped, she said quietly. He leaned back, studying her like a suspect. You've been doing this too long. You're starting to see ghosts. She didn't argue. But that night, when she got back to her motel room, she pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote the words she hadn't been able to let go of for 16 years. Who put the car there? She called the county clerk's office the next morning, asked for old utility maps from 1988, specifically any records of work crews or equipment near the riverbank that spring. The clerk's voice crackled with surprise. That's old stuff, detective. Might take a day. Take 2, she said. By the second afternoon, she had her answer. A private trenching company had done pipeline work along that section of river in early April 1988, just weeks after Lisa vanished. One of the foremen listed on the invoice was named E. Harland. She'd seen that name before. In one of the early witness statements, a local mechanic had mentioned a man named Harland who'd helped Dale Wayne Eaton fix a truck in '87. A loner, lived out near the storage lots, liked to tinker. No one ever tracked him down. Sarah went through the old photo evidence again. One image, shot wide from above the dig site, showed the faint outline of a tire tread near the burial pit. She zoomed in till the pixels blurred, then stopped. The tread pattern didn't match Eaton's truck. It was smaller, like from a trailer. A trailer could carry a car. By the time the courthouse reconvened the next morning, she was no longer watching the trial. She was watching the background. Eaton didn't look at her when they passed in the hall, but something in his expression, almost relief, chilled her worse than anger ever could. Because maybe, just maybe, he believed she'd finally seen what he'd been trying to say all along. Still, justice isn't clean, and it wasn't her job to save a guilty man from a better story. But when the verdict came down, guilty, first-degree murder, Sarah didn't clap, didn't smile. She just closed her notebook and left before the reporters could turn her face into a headline. Out in the parking lot, she looked toward the horizon, where the storm clouds were rolling in again from the west, low and gray like the ones from 1988. The road was still out there, long and indifferent, ready to take on another secret if the world had one to give. And somewhere in her gut, a thought whispered like static over a dead radio line. The man who buried the car might still be alive.
Snow fell in thin, steady lines over the Wind River Plain, the kind of winter that never truly leaves Wyoming. Detective Sarah Vance pulled her scarf tighter as she stepped out of her unmarked car, boots crunching on gravel slick with ice. The old pipeline yard hadn't changed much since 1988. Rows of rusted drums, chain-link fences leaning like tired men, a corrugated shed with a broken window and a door that still said Harland Construction in peeling blue paint. The wind cut clean through the quiet. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. Inside, dust lay thick over everything. Tools, files, a rotary phone frozen in mid-ring. She clicked on her flashlight and swept the beam across the walls. A faded work calendar hung by a nail, April 1988, circled in red pencil. Beneath it, a coffee tin labeled Keys. Inside, half a dozen, all tagged, one marked Storage 5, Back Lot.
Sarah's breath caught. The back lot was a gravel patch just beyond the main yard, fenced off, half swallowed by weeds. The padlock on the gate had corroded to powder. She nudged it loose and pushed the door open. At first, it was just junk. Old pipes, cracked generators, a fridge turned on its side. Then her flashlight caught something buried under a tarp, a small flatbed trailer. The wood slats were weathered, the hitch still greasy. Her beam moved lower, tracing the faint white outline of paint on the rail. F27K. Her heart stopped. That was the partial plate the waitress in '88 had remembered. The car that had sped out of the lot the night Lisa disappeared. A Tacoma pickup, maybe. She crouched closer, touched the metal, and felt the cold like a pulse in her palm. That's when she heard it. The crunch of tires on ice. Someone else was here. She ducked behind the trailer, hand on her holster. Headlights swept through the cracks of the wall, slow, deliberate. A truck engine idled, then shut off. Footsteps crunched. A man's voice, low and strained, called into the dark. "Who's in there?" She stepped out, badge raised. "Detective Vance, Fremont County Sheriff's Office." The figure froze in the doorway. Tall, gray-bearded, wearing a work coat faded to the color of dust. His eyes flicked to her badge, then to the trailer behind her. "This is private property." "Not anymore," she answered. "You Edwin Harland?" He didn't reply, but his silence was enough. She kept her distance. "You worked this site in 1988, correct?" He rubbed his jaw, eyes darting toward the trailer. "That's a long time ago. Long enough for people to forget. You knew Dale Eaton." At the sound of the name, his hand trembled slightly. Everyone knew Dale. He was trouble even back then. She took a step closer. "The Dwyer case is done. He's serving life, but I've been rechecking files. This yard's name turned up in the original contract for the pipeline dig, the same section of river where Lisa Kimmell's car was buried." He swallowed. "You people already dug up enough ghosts." "Maybe not all of them." He shifted, boots crunching on frost. The silence between them stretched until it cracked. "I didn't touch that girl. But Dale, he owed me. Money, favors, parts. He said he'd messed up bad and needed a place to move something heavy for a few days. Said it was just a car, nothing more. I told him to leave it behind the lot." Her pen moved before she realized it. "Behind this lot?" He nodded toward the dark stretch beyond the fence. "Over that ridge near the waterline. Said he'd come back to deal with it before the weekend." "And did he?" Harlan's eyes darted away. "No. Next time I saw him, he acted like it never happened. The car vanished. I figured he sold it for scrap. Didn't know what it was till the news broke years later." Her flashlight drifted toward the trailer again, over the rust, the paint, the number that matched a memory. "And you didn't tell anyone?" "I tried. Called the sheriff's office in '91. They said the case was in Colorado or Montana. I hung up." His breath fogged white in the cold. "By then, I'd already burned half my records. Didn't want trouble." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Trouble found you anyway." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind hissed through the cracks, tugging at the tarp like a hand. Finally, she asked the question that had kept her up for years. "Did you help him bury the car?" Harlan's voice dropped to a whisper. "No. I just told him where the ground was soft." She let the words settle. They were heavy, but they fit. They made sense of the angle, the effort, the one piece that hadn't belonged to Eaton's story. Someone had shown him where to dig, even if he'd done the digging himself. Sarah exhaled slowly, lowering her flashlight. "You understand this means you're part of the investigation now?"
I'm 71, detective. You can't charge me for telling the truth too late. Maybe not, but I'll make sure it's written down. She took his statement in the cold, her pen barely working, the ink freezing as fast as her fingers. When she finally looked up from the notepad, Harland had turned toward the horizon, the first thin light of dawn cutting through the cloud cover. His breath drifted into the air like smoke. He said quietly, almost to himself, he thought burying her car would bury the memory. But the road never forgets, does it? No. It just waits for someone to drive it again. Weeks later, Sarah filed her supplemental report. New witness, corroborated details, potential accomplice. The DA thanked her, politely, and nothing more came of it. Eaton's appeal was denied. The world, satisfied with its conclusion, moved on. But not Sarah. One late night, unable to sleep, she drove back to that stretch of highway outside Casper. Snow drifted over the asphalt, soft and soundless. She pulled over where the guardrail bowed slightly, the place Lisa had last been seen alive. Headlights from a passing semi rolled across her windshield, washing the world in brief, blinding white. She looked out into the dark fields, the ghosts of tire tracks buried beneath fresh snow, and whispered to no one, "We found the truth, just not all of it." The wind didn't answer. It never did. In her rearview mirror, the reflection of her dashboard clock flickered. 11:11 p.m. The digital glow caught on the corner of a small envelope tucked under her wipers. She hadn't noticed it when she parked. She stepped out, boots crunching on ice, the highway sighing behind her. The envelope was plain, damp from snow, the handwriting almost illegible. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed a shallow grave in hard earth, the same kind of grave they'd found years ago, but not the same one. And scrawled beneath it, in faint blue pen, she wasn't the only one. She stared at it for a long time, the snow stinging her face, the wind rushing past like breath over a secret. Somewhere beyond the reach of her headlights, the road curved toward the mountains, quiet, waiting. "If you thought this one was wild," she whispered to herself, the Polaroid trembling in her hand.